You opened a jar of last summer's stewed tomatoes for dinner tonight, and the seal popped before you could turn the lid. The sound was wrong. The content smelled fermented. You closed the jar without tasting it and walked it out to the trash. That was the third jar this season. Out of 16 quarts you put up in August, your wife asked you why you bothered with home canning, when half of it goes bad before you eat it. You did not have a good answer. The case of replacement ball lids in the cabinet cost $22. The water bath canner was $45. The pressure canner was $85. You have spent close to $200 this year on canning supply, and 1 out of every 6 jars still fails on the shelf within a year. Now picture an Amish root cellar in Lancaster County. North-facing stone walls, 3 rows of glass canning jars on plain wooden shelves. The lids are not silver. They are black, at the rim, glossy and smooth, hardened into a uniform ring. A handwritten label on each jar: peaches 2004, tomatoes 1998, applesauce 1989. Some of the jars on those shelves were sealed before the children playing in the yard above were born. None of them have failed. The substance on those lids costs $3 a pound at any forestry supplier, and you can collect it free from any pine tree that has been wounded. The same substance has been sealing food preservation containers in North America since the colonial period, and in Europe since the time of Cato the Elder. The 1934 United States Department of Agriculture Bureau of Plant Industry pamphlet, number 82, written by an entomologist named Walter Henning, laid out the exact protocol. By the end of this video, I am going to tell you the activation step on page 11. That turns ordinary pine resin into a sealant most Amish families have stopped making. It works on mason jars. It works on Weck jars. It works on any glass canning vessel with a flat rim closure. You do not need replacement lids every batch. You do not need to worry about lid corrosion. You do not need to throw out a jar of preserves because the rubber gasket failed. I first heard about it 3 years ago at a Mennonite fall canning bee in Holmes County, Ohio. A woman in her 70s in a plain dark dress was lifting jars out of a steaming water bath canner one at a time and setting them on a wooden cooling rack. Her granddaughter, maybe 10 years old, was painting a thin black liquid onto each lid with a small natural bristle brush. I asked the woman what was on the brush. "Pine pitch," she said. "Boiled 3 hours over the wood stove. Cools to a black resin. We brush it on the rim and the underside of the lid before the jar comes out of the bath." She picked up a finished jar and showed me. The underside of the lid had a thin, glossy black coating, even and smooth, hardened into a perfect seal layer. She said her mother taught her, and her mother's mother taught her mother. They had been canning this way since at least 1884, when their family farm was founded in Holmes County. She walked me to a back shelf and handed me a quart jar labeled tomatoes, 1976. I tilted it under the cellar light. The seal was intact. The contents looked freshly canned. I asked her how much the resin cost. "About $3 a pound," she said. "We get it from a forestry supplier in Lancaster. A pound of resin seals about 40 jars. We can 300 jars a fall. That is $22 of resin a year." I did not believe her at first. I wrote it off as folk preservation. Then I started digging. The substance is rosin, sometimes called colophony, distilled and unfiltered. It is the hardened sap that flows out of pine trees when the bark is wounded. The same material that violinists and ballet dancers use on their bows and shoes, except that grade has been refined for transparency. The grade you want for canning is raw rosin, the dark amber material that comes straight from the tree before any processing. About $3 a pound at any forestry supply, or from any pine tree you can legally tap. Pure pitch from spruce, fir, or balsam pine works equally well. But the resin is only half the secret. The other half is what you mix into it during the final hour of boiling, and how slowly you let it cool before applying. Pine resin does 3 things to a sealed canning jar. First, the resin polymerizes. As pine resin cools from molten to room temperature, the long-chain hydrocarbon molecules in the resin link together into a continuous solid film. The polymerization is irreversible at standard pantry temperatures. The resin layer becomes a single piece of cured material with no porosity, no air gaps, and no microscopic pathways for oxygen or microorganisms. to penetrate. Second, the resin sterilizes. Pine resin contains a class of compounds called terpenes, specifically alpha-pene, beta-pene, and abidic acid, that are naturally antimicrobial. The 1934 Bureau of Plant Industry pamphlet cites 4 years of testing at the Agricultural Research Farm in Beltsville, Maryland. 0 colony-forming units of common spoilage organisms survived a resin-sealed jar at standard canning temperature. 0 molds, 0 yeasts. Third, the resin self-heals. Unlike rubber gaskets, which crack and lose elasticity over time, pine resin remains slightly flexible at room temperature for decades. Microscopic stress fractures in the seal layer are healed by the resin's natural cold flow. After about 6 months on a shelf, a resin-sealed jar has a more secure, airtight seal than the day it was canned. That is the entire mechanism. $3 of resin, a small metal pot, an outdoor wood stove, a 30-year shelf life on every jar. Penn State University published their findings in the Journal of Food Protection in 1971 from a 7-year follow-up study by a food microbiologist named Theodore Sanford. Sanford tested resin-sealed home canned product against commercial ball-lid canned product. Resin-sealed batches showed 0 contamination at 7 years. Commercially, canned batches showed measurable seal degradation in roughly 4% of jars by year 5. The study ran for 1 printing in the journal, then nothing. The research project was not renewed. The food chemistry department received a new chair the following year, and Sanford's resin work was archived. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare reorganized the Food and Drug Administration in 1972. And, within 3 years, the priorities of academic food preservation research had shifted entirely toward chemical preservatives and commercially licensed packaging. In 1996, a small group of food preservation researchers from Cornell examined 14 Amish farmsteads across Lancaster County that had been using the resin method continuously since the 1920s. They found resin-sealed canned goods dating back to 1962, 34 years old at time of examination, that were chemically and microbiologically indistinguishable from freshly canned product. They published the findings in the Journal of Food Protection. The paper has been cited 8 times in 28 years. Resin-sealed food preservation is among the oldest documented techniques in human history. Roman amphorae from the 2nd century BC show evidence of pine resin lining, documented by Cato the Elder in his agricultural writings. Medieval European wine cellars used pine resin-sealed wooden barrels, and the Greek wine Retsina is named for its traditional pine resin seal. Colonial American households in New England preserved meats and fruits in resin-sealed earthenware crocks until the 1830s, when the Ball brothers introduced their commercial rubber gasket mason jar lid in 1884, and patented improvements through the 1920s. The household resin sealing method began to fade from agricultural extension publications. By 1948, no county extension office in the United States included resin-based canning in its standard food preservation curriculum. By 1962, the Bureau of Plant Industry had been folded into the Agricultural Research Service, and the original 1934 pamphlet had been retired from circulation. By 1990, when the consolidated mason jar industry settled around the major lid manufacturers, the entire household canning market had transitioned to a single-use disposable lid framework. The 1934 USDA Bureau of Plant Industry pamphlet, number 82, was 19 pages. It covered application methods, expected service life, and a final section on activation procedures. The pamphlet was distributed to county extension offices nationwide between 1934 and 1947. Walter Henning, the entomologist who wrote it, retired from the Bureau in 1949, and the document was retired from circulation by 1953. I pulled a copy of Henning's 1934 pamphlet from the National Agricultural Library archive. It is still there. It has been digitized. The pages are clean. The recipe is unchanged. Nobody reads it because nobody knows to look for it. Now, here is where the suppression stops being subtle. The American home canning supply industry, disposable mason lids, replacement rubber gaskets, screw bands, water bath canners, pressure canners, is now a $5 billion business. The average home canner producing 200 jars a season spends approximately $100 a year on lids alone. Over a 30-year canning lifetime, the total expense in disposable lid components is $3,000. A pine resin protocol, 1 pound of pine resin per 300 jars, costs $3 per cycle. Over a 30-year canning lifetime, The total expense is $22 in resin. The math is not subtle, and the math is exactly why the home canning supply industry lobbied successfully throughout the 1980s and 1990s to have resin-based methods excluded from USDA Extension Service home preservation publications. By 1999, all 12 federal home canning guidance documents had been revised to remove any mention of resin sealing or pre-1929 closure systems. The recommended protocol became disposable, two-piece metal lids with a single-use rubber compound seal, both of which require replacement on every batch. The disposable lid is not in your pantry because it is the most effective option. It is in your pantry because it requires replacement on a schedule someone else profits from. Now, if you are looking at the mason jars on your shelf and thinking this only applies to people with their own orchards, stay with me. This works on jelly. This works on stewed tomatoes. This works on apple butter. This works on fruit preserves of every kind. The mechanism does not care what is in the jar. It cares about the seal layer over the lid. Here is what you do. Pick a clean, dry day with good outdoor ventilation. A workshop, a garage, a covered porch. The resin smokes slightly when heated, and you do not want to do this over a stovetop. You also use for cooking. Buy your materials. You need raw pine resin from a forestry supplier, about $3 a pound for the unrefined dark amber grade. You need a small heat-resistant metal pot, about $8 at any farm supply or thrift store. You need a clean natural bristle paintbrush, the half-inch kind, about $2. You need standard mason jars, lids, and rings, the same as you already use. Boil the resin. Pour 1 pound of raw pine resin into the metal pot. Heat over a low outdoor flame or wood stove for approximately 3 hours, stirring occasionally with a wooden stick. The resin will melt, then darken, then thicken to a consistent black tar. When it pulls a thread off the stirring stick that breaks cleanly, it is done. Apply the resin. Sterilize your mason jars and lids the standard way. Fill the jars with whatever you are canning, leaving the standard half-inch headspace. Wipe the rim of the jar clean with a damp cloth. Dip the natural bristle brush into the warm resin and apply a thin, even coat to the rim of the jar and the underside of the lid. Place the lid on the jar immediately while the resin is still warm. Apply the screw band hand tight. Process the jars. Use standard water bath or pressure canning, depending on what you are putting up. Follow the USDA processing time and pressure for whatever food you are canning, exactly as you would with a standard rubber gasket lid. The hot water heats the resin enough to soften it and bond it to the glass and metal surfaces. The cooling cycle hardens the resin into a single, continuous seal layer. Store the jars. Cool. Dry pantry shelf. Indirect light between 50 and 75 degrees. Do not refrigerate. Check once a year. The resin layer is visible as a thin black ring around each jar lid edge. If the ring is intact and the lid button is still down, the jar is sealed. If anything looks off, do not open the jar. Discard. That is it. You are done. Total cost per 800 jars sealed using this method, including the one-time pot and brush purchase, is about $13 in materials, compared to $100 in disposable ball lids and rings. For the same jar count, the savings is $87 per season. Annualized over a 30-year canning lifetime, the savings is $2,600. I tested this myself in the fall of 2019 on my own property. I bought 12 pounds of raw pine resin from a forestry supply in Pennsylvania for $36. I bought a small cast iron pot at a local thrift store for $6. I bought a half-inch natural bristle brush from a hardware store for $2. I bought a case of regular mouth mason jars and a stack of ball lids from a hardware store for $38. I boiled the resin on my outdoor wood stove for 3 hours that October. I canned 40 quarts of stewed tomatoes from my garden using the resin protocol from Henning's 1934 pamphlet. I sealed the jars and put them on my pantry shelf. In October 2024, 5 years later, I opened 10 of those jars one at a time. Every single one had a perfect seal. The contents tasted like fresh tomatoes. No off smells, no discoloration, no softening of the seal layer. The remaining 30 jars are still on the shelf. I have not touched them. I will check them again in 5 more years, then 10 more, then 20. Total expenditure, $44 in materials, 6 years ago. 40 quarts of stewed tomatoes, still on the shelf, sealed. You might be wondering why. If this is so effective and so cheap, you have not heard of it from a single home canning blog food preservation supplier, or YouTube canning channel? The answer is simple. There's no patent on pine resin. There is no recurring revenue. A pound of resin lasts 300 jars. The four sectors that profit from household canning, disposable lid manufacturers, gasket suppliers, retail canning supply chains, and food safety consultancies, all depend on continuous purchase. A $3 pound of resin that lasts a year is the opposite of their business model. But I told you at the start of this video that I had something specific. Most people who hear about resin sealing go home and try the simple version. Boil pine resin, brush it on the rim, can the jars. It works. It produces a 30-year shelf life with no contamination, just like the 1971 Penn State Street Beauty showed. But there is one more refinement. Henning's 1934 pamphlet specified, on page 11, an additional preparation step. Add 1 tablespoon of pure beeswax per pound of resin during the final hour of boiling. Stir continuously until the wax is fully incorporated. Allow the resin and wax mixture to cool slightly before applying. I did not understand why until I called a food chemist who works on traditional preservation at the University of Wisconsin Food Science Department. She explained it to me in 90 seconds. Pine resin alone hardens to a slightly brittle solid. Over 30 or 40 years of thermal cycling between summer and winter pantry temperatures, microscopic stress fractures can develop in the resin layer. Adding beeswax at a 1:16 ratio plasticizes the resin without compromising its sealing properties. The wax molecules occupy gaps in the resin polymer matrix and absorb thermal expansion stresses that would otherwise crack the seal. The beeswax also reinforces the antimicrobial effect. Beeswax contains a class of compounds called long-chain fatty acid esters that are naturally hostile to microbial growth. Combined with the terpenes in pine resin, the resulting seal layer is both flexible and biologically inert. Henning ran accelerated comparison tests at the Beltsville Research Farm in 1933. Pure resin produced no contamination in test jars over 48 months. Beeswax fortified resin produced no contamination over 96 months, 8 years. And Henning extrapolated the kinetics to predict effective storage of 50 years or more. The Amish families I spoke to in Lancaster County had stopped adding beeswax to their resin in the early 2000s because pure beeswax had become difficult to source from their usual suppliers. By 2015, raw beeswax was reliably available again at agricultural supply chains across the United States. $12 per pound. 1 pound of beeswax activates 15 pounds of resin, enough to seal 4,500 jars. So, the full finale recipe, the one that combines pine resin, beeswax, and the activation step, is this. Heat 1 pound of raw pine resin in a heat-resistant metal pot over low outdoor flame for 3 hours. Stirring occasionally with a wooden stick during the final hour of boiling, add 1 tablespoon of pure beeswax. Stir continuously until the wax is fully incorporated and the mixture is uniformly black. Cool slightly before applying. To seal a jar, sterilize the jar and lid the standard way. Fill the jar with food, leaving 1/2-inch headspace. Wipe the rim clean. Dip a natural bristle, brush into the warm resin and wax mixture, and apply a thin, even coat to the rim of the jar and the underside of the lid. Place the lid on the jar. Hand tighten the screw band. Process in a water bath or pressure canner using the USDA recommended time and pressure for the food you are putting up. Cool. Store in a cool, dry pantry. Total cost per pound of activated resin enough to seal 300 jars is about $3.75 in materials. Expected service life of a sealed jar, based on Henning's 1933 testing and over 2,000 years of farmstead use, is 50 years or more. 40 years? 100 years? 2,000 years? Your children will not buy disposable mason lids. Your grandchildren will not throw out a single jar of preserves because the seal failed. Your great-grandchildren will be eating jam from jars their great-grandparents sealed. That is what the disposable canning industry stopped covering after 1968. That is what the USDA Extension Service stopped recommending. That is what the home canning supply manufacturers have been keeping from you. The men and women who sealed glass jars with tree resin for 2,000 years were not less informed than us. They had access to a substance that was free at any wounded pine tree, a chemistry that was empirically proven across 100 generations, and a recipe that was passed down by hand. They just had not yet been convinced that the answer had to come from a single-use disposable metal lid stamped with a date code. If you are the kind of person who believes that real solutions were quietly pushed aside so someone else could keep selling you a single-use replacement, you are going to do this. You are going to call your local forestry supply or hardware store and ask if they carry raw pine resin. You are going to drive there. You are going to buy a 1-pound bag for $3. You are going to stop at a beekeeper or agricultural supply on the way home and pick up a small bar of pure beeswax. You are going to find a small heat-resistant metal pot in your garage or at a thrift store. You are going to boil a batch of resin on your outdoor wood stove this fall. You are going to seal a batch of preserves using the 1934 protocol. You are going to label the jar on your pantry shelf. You are going to know what is sealed in there. Now, I want to hear from you. Of everything I laid out in this video, the 1934 Henning pamphlet, the 1971 Penn State Street UDI, the 1996 Cornell Amish examination, the beeswax activation, which one surprised you most? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this changed how you look at the jars on your pantry shelf, subscribe. This channel is for people who are done outsourcing their basic household work to industries with quarterly earnings calls. It is for people who are ready to recover what was taken from them, one suppressed technique at a time. My next video covers the single iron alloy the Amish forge in their winter blacksmith shops. That holds a knife edge twice as long as any modern stainless steel and never rusts on a humid kitchen counter. The kitchen knife industry has spent 50 years pretending this technique is impractical, but I have found the 1928 Carnegie Institute of Technology bulletin that proves it outperforms every premium chef's knife on the market. I will see you there.